So I want to talk with you about the Dupont return on investment model, which is on the slide coming up right now, and tell you about a very interesting time in 1914. A young professional named Donaldson Brown was running the general staff office, supporting the executive team at the Dupont company. Now, Donaldson was not supposed to be in charge of the office that summer of 1914. But his boss, the executive staff director, was sick that summer and was forced to put this young man in charge. When Coleman Dupont, the president of the Dupont company, one of the biggest companies in America at that time, asked for an executive report on the operations of the entire company, young Mr. Brown saw his opportunity, walked into Dupont's office and presented to him the return on investment model, which computationally is an extremely clean way to think about how we achieve the return on investment that is important to many organizations. It's a function of two mathematical ratios, the investment turnover ratio multiplied by the profit margin ratio. And as you'll see on the next slide, this model expands into a lot of computational detail. So let's go to and you can see here that the investment turnover ratio, sales divided by investment, and the profit margin ratio, profit divided by sales, starts detailing out into a lot of computational components. This became the focus of management at the Dupont company, subsequently at the General Motors GM company, and then expanded to more and more organizations since then. By the 1950s, the Dupont company had a huge room dedicated just to this model, with many poster boards and charts that were moving around this room under lock and key. Using this model, the Dupont framework, the Dupont model, the Dupont company could drill down on each individual item that computationally contributed to return on investment. Most of you are familiar with this model, I'm sure, and it's got an interesting history as a background. This model, if we look at its core components on the next slide, you'll see that it is the drivers of return on investment are three factors: sales, investment, and costs, with sales being spread throughout this model. Interestingly, since 1914 and the arrival of this model in front of Mr. Dupont by this young staffer, accounting and finance professionals have tended to focus largely on managing investments and costs, with sales and revenue management being acquiesced to other professionals in the organization, professionals in marketing and sales who know a great deal about this, but without the full partnership of accounting and finance professionals in many organizations who can bring to bear their special skills and prowess in analytics and control and system features. This model became very interesting to an organization that debuted a few years ago called PACE. You can see that down at the bottom of this slide, the Profitability Analytics Center of Excellence. This model we see as originally as a computational model, but we are interested in what causes sales, investment, and cost to move in the directions we want. It's not strictly a computational issue. On the next slide, we see this as an interaction, an integration of revenue that affects cost, cost that affects revenue, investments that drives both revenue and cost, and profitability and the analytics around causal factors of profitability sits at the center of that intersection, at the center of that Venn diagram. Considering this from a strategic point of view, we are able to build what we call the Profitability Analytics Framework, which is an expansion of the ROI model. And that framework is composed of these three factors: revenue, cost, and investment, spread across the three steps of strategic development. Next slide, please. So there are the three ROI factors. Strategy forms across three different stages. First, we're formulating the strategy by capturing analytics, both internal and external, to set strategy. And then we need to quantify that strategy into measurable aspects, both non-monetary and monetary aspects that define what we mean by revenue strategy, cost strategy, investment strategy. And then we need to execute that strategy and harvest the value that's created. And then the whole process starts again. These 6 factors then combine into a fairly comprehensive model that integrates across different stages of strategy and integrates across these 3 ROI factors. We're looking for causality. And here is that model. We call it the PACE Profitability Analytics Model on the next slide. You can see, if you've carried forward visually the previous slide, that we've got revenue, costs, and investments coming vertically down this framework, with strategy formulation, validation, and execution coming across horizontally. I'm going to walk you through this model in a building approach, starting with strategy formulation. So this is the core of the model, but I'm going to expand it now into more of its components. And we're watching for causality as a connective way through these 3 frames, down these 3 ROI factors. So on the next slide now, you'll see the strategy formulation framework being emphasized, with internal and external data used to forecast, plan, and capture actual factors related to formulating the marketing strategy for the organization, the core strategy. That strategy then informs the operational strategy, how we structure the organization, with the investment strategy put in place to support operations and marketing strategic goals. Coming across now to the next slide, that strategy formulation across marketing, operations, and investment then forms a causal set of models. What is the causal quantitatively? What causes the marketing goals to be achieved? What are we looking for? What levers are we going to start maneuvering? What are the operational models and their causal factors, and the investment model? These are non-monetary measures to begin with, but they need to be monetized. On to the next slide, as we continue to validate the strategy with causal models based on monetary measures. So in dollars and cents, or whatever the currency is for that organization, what are the fundamentals of driving revenue and managing costs and deploying investments? We capture and frame this in monetary measures. And this is where accounting and finance professionals are most clearly involved, but they've got to understand where these models are coming from, how they're based, how they're formulated. Moving on then, we execute this strategy on the next slide. With this strategy execution, we are deploying our revenue model across products, services, customers, channels, strategic business units, whatever it is that describes the specific monetized strategy for revenue in that organization. We track and manage costs across processes, activities, and cost drivers. And we are tracking on not just the traditional tangible definitions of investments and assets, but the intangible assets, the intellectual property, the HR capital, and other aspects that creates value, but is not formally reported on a balance sheet, needs to be captured and reported and tracked here. Finally, and I've run out of room on this slide, so on the next slide, you're going to see strategy execution. Stay there. And I've got one more step, and that step is the harvesting. As we harvest the value, tracking on revenue management and capturing value through the way we price and allocate inventory and services and configure the product and control our availability of our service or product, cost reductions, quality improvements, timely delivery of our operations, the way we are tracking on capital investments, our HR development values, our IP management. All of this is potentially levers that an organization tracks on. It's not computational. We're looking for causal relationships now in a way that we can model and track it and share this across the decision makers in the organization. Finally, on the next slide, you're going to see this last piece slip off just by virtue of the fact that we're running out of slide room. But all of this feeds back at the bottom with strategy evaluation based on what we have captured, what we've learned. That, of course, is a learning feedback. It loops back to strategy reformulation, and the whole thing begins again. This is not going to be surprising for many of you. This is generally how organizations that are successful are tracking on a complexity of many factors that need to form together for value creation and capture in the organization. The job of this is to frame it in a way that is comprehensive, integrative, and sensible, that can involve accounting and finance professionals into more aspects of strategy, development, and deployment. So this is the Profitability Analytics Framework. This was developed by the PACE organization, who I represent in today's webinar. On the next slide, I just want to point out the Profitability Analytics Center of Excellence, PACE, and invite you to come join us. We are a partner to FP&A Trends, performing similar kind of work at this very objective nonprofit organization composed of researchers, practitioners, and consultants like my colleagues here, who are working to better understand, develop, and deploy models of management to track costs and revenue drivers and performance measures deployed through investment structures. So that's the Profitability Analytics framework.